Welcome to Social Innovation, the Kaleidoscope, created by the Cambridge Center for Social Innovation. We share the different colors and facets of social innovation around the world. I'm Berenice Pardo. Let's begin with a very simple question. What do you do?
I am the Western and Central Pacific Tuna Program Manager for the Worldwide Fund for Nature, also known as WWF. My work is around policy and advocacy with respect to conservation and management of our tuna resources in the Western and Central Pacific, which is basically the Pacific Islands region from the Aleutian Islands all the way to Australia.
Talking about tuna, one of the things I was quite surprised about when I was doing the research for this is that I thought of the canned tuna rather than the animal, which was a bit scary, I must say, because I felt, it's been de-animalized rather than dehumanized, de-animalized in a way that it's so readily available in the supermarket that we don't think of the animal anymore.
Sure, I think you're right. You know, we've commoditized tuna and all fish really to the point where most people don't think of it as an animal. They think of it as food, and or even worse, they don't tend to think of it as an important part of the ecosystem and the role that it serves, and not just its role as a predator in an ecological context, but also as a carbon sink in terms of our carbon cycle and climate change.
You have touched perfectly into the question that I wanted to ask now, which is the essential role of tuna in the ecosystem. Could you explain just a tiny bit more? You mentioned a bit, but just a tiny bit more.
Sure. So tuna tend to be upper level predators, and they're obviously not the top predators, because that would be like, you know, your orca whales or your large sharks, you know, great white sharks and that kind of thing. But they do play a very important role as predators in the ecosystem, and at some level, you know, as they're growing as prey. So, you know, they're an important part of the ecosystem as far as the complex food chains or food webs that exist in the ocean, and the role that they play is to ensure that there's a balance, just like every other organism in that ecosystem. And so it's a bit like a big sweater that might have a thread that's coming out. If you pull that one thread, you basically unravel the entire sweater if you're not careful.
So you're talking basically about how we fish and how much we're fishing, right? How are you, from your role at the WWF, how are you trying to manage this, change this, or work on this?
Sure. So if you look at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization statistics, there's about 80% of the world's fish that are either fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted, which means that there's not very much room for an increase in catch. And at the end of the day, fisheries are about accountability. So we just need to ensure that we're only withdrawing the amount of interest that doesn't dig into the principal, to use an accounting analogy. And so my role is to ensure that we have measures in place that help ensure that accountability in the fisheries. So that means having adequate monitoring, control, and surveillance mechanisms in place. In other words, you know, ensuring that there's enforcement officers, making sure that the fishermen are following the rules, or that there are tools in place like electronic monitoring or cameras or satellite monitoring or other tools to ensure that all fishermen are not only being held accountable by the public, but they're holding each other accountable. And then the other part of my role, and more recently, has been looking at finding technological solutions to help support management and monitoring, control, and surveillance. Additionally, looking at how consumers can have an impact through their informed buying on the supply chain through the markets, using tools like RFIDs, or radio frequency ID tags on fish, so you can identify you know, what you're buying and where it's from and attributes associated with it, which can also be supported by something that's a bit new called blockchain technology, which some people may be familiar with as far as cryptocurrency. But blockchain is separate from cryptocurrencies, and that could be an entirely separate podcast. But there's a lot of technologies that can help us address some of these sustainability challenges through support from consumers like yourselves and your listeners, but also through tools that our management and enforcement agencies can use to ensure that the fishing industry is doing what they're supposed to do.
Talking a bit more about the blockchain, which, if I understand correctly, it's what will allow the traceability, right? So that I, as a consumer, can check where the fish come from, who caught it, and how it's produced until I got it into my plate. Is that right?
Right. So the idea is that it will be sort of a holy grail, that the technology could provide the uninterrupted and infallible chain of information that would allow a consumer to see all the way up the chain and all of the information about that fish, how and where it was produced, what attributes are associated with it, whether it's fair trade or sustainable or whatever is a value that's important to you as a consumer. You would be able to see it for that product, and it creates incentives on both ends of the supply chain as well. Some of the fishermen that we work with that are interested in the technology are really interested in achieving product control. Like, they want to be able to identify what markets that their fish goes into that helps them achieve a higher price. At the moment, once they sell it, it just goes away. And, very often they're subject to transfer pricing where, a chain of several middlemen may, be profiting off of the hard work of the fishermen. And that same fish that they're selling at the dock for, say, $4 a kg may be selling for more than $30 a pound in the US market. So looking at the potential of that technology to provide that trust and transparency in the supply chain is very enticing to a lot of institutions like our own, who see it as a way to help shift the buying power through informed consumers who can go into a market and confidently purchase something that aligns with their values, that rewards the guys that are doing the right thing and excludes all the guys who aren't.
In organizing this blockchain, and you as the program manager, do you work with the supermarkets, with the fisheries, with the government? How do you put all the pieces together?
Well, it's a bit of a challenge at the moment because there seems to be a lot of interest from a lot of different sectors, whether it's the consumer sector or the retail sector, the wholesale sector, the producer sector, the fishers themselves. But actually linking all those bits together has been the real challenge. Of course, everyone wants the benefits, but there usually aren't very many people who want to pay additional costs. So that makes it challenging to figure out, okay, well, who's going to pay for this, and how are we going to connect all these pieces together? And at the end of the day, it's basically going to boil down to market demand. Does the market want it? Do consumers want to know more about where their fish comes from and how it's produced? And I think the signals that we're seeing from the market is that, the consumers are like, look, if I have a way where I can confidently know where my fish comes from and how it's produced, you bet I'd buy it. I'd be more likely to not only be more likely to buy it, I'd be more likely to pay a few cents more for it. And so our role is to try and connect all those bits together and develop projects or pilots that help prove the technology, which is our first foray into the technology was back in 2018, where we were able to actually demonstrate that it was a viable technological tool that could be used in the tuna fisheries. We were able to trace, tuna from the point that it came over the rail on the vessel all the way through processing and ultimately to its end market in a couple of one-off pilots going to large events in the US, one in New York and one in San Francisco. But scaling that to a commercial level has proven to be the real challenge.
In this sense of what's first, the awareness of the consumer so that the supermarket offers it, or the other way around, how in a perfect world or in a couple of years, how do you imagine this functioning?
Well, I think the evolution that we're going to see in coming years it's similar to other technology revolutions. They start with tools that are large, clunky, expensive, and difficult to invest in, and that's why we've only seen these types of traceability technologies employed in high value products. Beef going into the hospitality industry, high value tuna or toothfish going into the hospitality industry. But I think, as with all technologies, over time, it gets more compact, it gets more inexpensive, and more available. And eventually the technology will become ubiquitous, and it will become a question of policy and practice rather than a question of expense and difficulty in implementing. So I think that we will see a large surge in interest in application in traceability. And I think that that's also going to drive these various technologies.
I don't know if you agree with me, but one of the good effects of the pandemic is that we have become a lot more conscious of the challenges in the supply chains and in the environment, and how us not messing around with the world does help. So I hope we do become a bit more conscious.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And keep in mind that this technology could be applied to anything, and that includes cotton and coffee, and not to mention, beef and other meat products, or even vegetables. IBM Food Trust is tracing all of its leafy greens at the moment that go into the Walmart markets using a blockchain tool. So, and the way that it would work for consumers like yourself is, you could go into a market and either scan a QR code, which all of us have gotten a lot more familiar with as a result of the pandemic, or ultimately, in my vision, is that you don't even have you won't even have to physically scan something. If you have a particular buying preference for, say, greens from Uruguay or something like that, then you could walk into a supermarket and your phone would alert you. Your personal device would say, hey, over on aisle 10, there's greens from Uruguay that and we know that you're interested in buying. And by the way, it's sustainable and GMO free, or whatever value that you hold important. So you wouldn't almost even have to think about it. The market would help you decide for you. And I think that's really helpful, because the common complaint as WWF that we hear from consumers is, look, just tell us what we should buy, make it easy for us. And that's been the real challenge, because there's all of these standards and there's all of these tools, that are from different organizations and entities saying, well, this is what you should buy, or this is what you should buy. And sometimes they conflict. Or sometimes they're not fully consistent. And so if we can provide a tool that actually gives all the information to the consumer and says, here it is, you can see for yourself, you don't have to trust us, then we've achieved a huge accomplishment there. And so that's really what we hope to see. And I think you're right that the pandemic has helped expose a lot of inadequacies or frailties in the supply chain that have made this technology a lot more appealing. I've said since the beginning of the pandemic, if we had a system like a blockchain traceability tool in place, then we wouldn't have had some of the negative impacts that resulted from the supply chain breakdown. And even if we did, they wouldn't have lasted as long, because if you can see at an instant where your supply is through a blockchain traceability tool, say, oh, well, I've got a demand here, I know that there's a supply there, then you've basically solved 90% of the supply chain problem at that point.
The last question about this would be, are you working on the software, on providing it to the consumers, or will you look into distributing it somewhere else, or you need to work on that still?
Well, it's interesting that you should say that. As a result of our initial engagement with blockchain technology, we were working with two technology providers that were very supportive of our work. One was Traceable Solutions, which is a Pacific Islands based traceability firm, and the other was Consensus, which is one of the largest blockchain providers on the planet. And as a result of that experience, we decided, this is really, it could be an important tool for sustainability. And so we engaged in a project with an institution called Boston Consulting Group, which they have a digital ventures outfit that we partnered with, along with Humanity United, to establish OpenSC, which is a profit for purpose company that specializes in blockchain traceability. And at this time, we're tracing through the blockchain to Antarctic toothfish, about 10% of the Antarctic toothfish that goes into the market, and have projects across a number of other commodities, including beef and dairy and some other commodities to basically do what I was explaining earlier, to give consumers an informed choice. And so that's uncharacteristic for WWF as a conservation organization to engage in that space, but we believe that it was the right direction to go to provide that type of product and service that ultimately could help drive the broader approach to technology solutions for sustainability challenges.
So it sounds like collaboration is what will allow that scalability.
Absolutely. And I think, it's a competitive space right now. There's a lot of companies that are engaged in the space, and that's a good thing, because everyone that demonstrates success or experiences a failure, we all learn from those failures as well, is, elevating the profile of the potential of the tool, as well as implementing various levels of the technology across the world in different commodities. And at the end of the day, a rising tide floats all boats, and we expect that that the technology will continue to grow and expand, and very soon make it possible for consumers to make those informed choices.
Yeah, that does sound interesting, a bit of sci-fi, but it looks. I really look forward to seeing that in place. Until that happens, if you had a suggestion for us as normal consumers to do something that will impact and help you achieve this, what would it be?
Be curious and be informed. And that's what we need. We need, the consumers to go in and be proactive and be informed and say, look, I'm not going to buy this product anymore because you can't prove to me where it comes from, or you can't prove to me what's in it, or you can't prove to me that it's not produced with, as a product of human misery. So give me those tools, and I'll be more faithful to your company or your product. And that's really, what drives the market and allows us to move governments forward and to move policy forward in a way that ensures we sustain our oceans for future generations. There's a lot of threats at the moment between climate change and overfishing and pollution, that the more help we can get from the public, the better chance we have of being able to do our jobs and secure a brighter future for all of humanity.